Good afternoon. This is a public hearing which was scheduled according to all the ordinance of that sort of thing in the newspapers, and people notified as they needed to be or not needed to be. And this is April 27th, 2006, and it's 2:35. Present from the Planning Commission are Mayor Abel and myself, Joanne. We don't have to have a quorum, so it isn't necessary. All we're doing, we're listening to what the public has to say about these things. We're not having discussion or anything else. We just want to hear what the public has to say. We've passed a sheet around. Mr. Leatherwood was late. If he wants to speak, he wants to sign that. And we are going to do University Estates first. Now, we take sworn statements, or if you plan to say anything, would you please stand and raise your right hand? But you're going to tell the truth. Nobody's going to say anything. He's the only one who's going to say anything. He's going to say something. Could you swear that you're going to tell the truth? Okay. All right. All right. This is, the question here is the zoning of University Estates, and it was submitted with a great many zones in it. So we wish to have, now, do you want to say anything about your request? And then does anybody else want to speak to University Estates?
What's the procedure? If you want me to.
Well, you can tell us why you put these in the way you did if you want. Have you changed this from the last time you were here? Okay. All right. So we felt that there were a number of inconsistencies and requests for the, especially B1, we felt was not a legitimate request. Okay.
My name is Lance Rose from University Estates. The map that Joanne has is the same as this map, except this one's colored in. We've designated the commercial area as mostly up front, with a little bit around the clubhouse, and a small area right here. This is the Equestrian Park. This is actually zoned commercial because we got some storage buildings we're planning in the future down there. It also has a maintenance facility. The darker yellow is the multifamily. The lighter yellow is the single family. And the green is, both shades of green is the golf course and green space in the community. I guess one of the questions that came up at the Planning Commission hearing was this center area right here is, I guess there's two ways to look at it. We thought it should be B1, and then there's been some conversation that it could be just as easily be R3. So that was one of the issues. Some of the other areas were multifamily and single family butt up against each other. As we go forward, some of this will be determined by the sales, whether single family sells at a faster rate or multifamily. So we just tried to put in zoning that would be in consistency with our density for the overall project. The Equestrian Park, we actually zoned it commercial, thinking that because we were probably going to rent space for people, residents, to store their horses, in some ways would be considered a business. So that was the reason for that zone. I think that's all the issues that were brought up, unless Joanne or...
And you've not made any changes at all, so that's...
No, we're still, the way I understood it was we had this public hearing, and before we come back to you at the next planning commission, that, if there's any changes, we have to present those at that time.
Well, the purpose of a public hearing is for the public to tell us what they think. Does anybody have anything they want to say about University Estates? Our problem with it is the business part of it. The B1 is a neighborhood type thing, And it was a zone that we had actually attempted to get rid of because it was put in basically to match what already existed when they had zoning, and there were these little mom and pop stores, little grocery stores in different areas, and so that was put in as neighborhood business, and we felt that neighborhood business is no longer appropriate. The businesses that were there in the first place could continue as long as there was not, they continued as that same business, but any break in it, then they would no longer to be able to have that business. So it's not actually a zone that we use anymore we don't designate anything that way. As I said, we would like to get rid of it. So the question of the business is something we're going to have to look at, how that works.
Maybe it would be appropriate to spring this on Steve. Can you briefly just describe what's allowed in a B1? I mean, what restrictions there are? Because I know that when you get to B3s, you have to have business on the first floor. But does that go all the way through the B zone now?
The way it's set up is the B1 zone permits everything permitted in R1, R2, or R3. So it just stacks on top of itself. B1, though, additionally, besides either single, family, duplex, or multifamily use, also includes neighborhoods, businesses supplying services mainly to people in the neighborhood. And, you know, that's why we had the discussion before. There are really such businesses anymore.
Well, most of these that are designated B1 here, other than the town square type thing, look to me to be primarily housing, multifamily housing. Right. Or condos that are for rent or timeshare or something like that. And it's my understanding, yes, you can build up with everything in the R is permitted in the B, and you don't. So you could have a B1 technically that has all residential in it.
That's correct.
Business.
That's correct.
But an R3 says it's primarily for multifamily housing.
Right. The difference between
you are allowed as a conditional use if you go to the zoning board for a B1 use within an R3.
Yeah, that was a recent change. With the change in the zoning code, there was this idea that possibly there are some low impact neighborhood kind of businesses that should be permitted. Let's just say, for example, in the Mill Street area, should a carry out be allowed, or some kind of convenience barber shop, something like that. The thought was that might keep people from having to drive. It was things people might want to walk to. So the code changed those to conditionally permitted uses. Those B1 neighborhood type business uses are conditionally permitted in an R3, principally permitted or permitted by right in a B1. And also permitted by right in a B1 is residential use on the first floor. When you jump up to the next zone, B2, residential use kicks up to the second floor. The first floor is reserved for commercial.
Let me ask you another question. In R1 and R2, you're limited to one structure.
That's correct.
In R3, you can have multiple structures on the same lot.
No.
No? In R3?
No. You can have multiple units in one building.
Okay.
You can't have multiple buildings. When it's multiple buildings, then it's a planned unit development.
Okay.
So you could have one huge building with 100 units in it, and I could do that permit down at the code office. If you have two buildings with 50 each, you come to the planning commission and the council.
Okay.
That's how the thing.
What's the requirement in a B1 as to the numbers of buildings? One?
The answer to that's no. Depends on the use. If there's any residential component to it at all, and there's multiple buildings, then it is a planned unit development. If it's all strictly business use, it's not a planned unit development. And I have a legal opinion from the law director on that. When the PUD regs were first written, there was some concern about multiple commercial buildings. Were they going to fall under the new PUD regs?
Right. Well, most of these areas that we're talking about the B1 in are unplatted at this time. They're not in the, it's just in essence, strategic plan or whatever you want to call it, master plan that they have for this particular development. So that's why I wanted to just briefly go through what
Sure.
B1s, as in any B, you can put multiple buildings and administratively be approved as long as they're
All commercial.
commercial.
But I think the confusion with the people who planned it is that they thought because you rented it out, that was commercial, but that's not what commercial means. I mean, just because you're gonna rent a apartment doesn't mean it's commercial.
Yeah.
That's not the deciding factor in that. Okay.
But it doesn't hurt, I think, when we have these public hearings and
To
those
explain it.
probably first explain what the zone is that allows what's there now, which in university, the state's thing is none of it's zoned. And then say, okay, of the zone, what are the zones being asked for and what can you do with them?
Well, and this makes a difference too, because you have a B up against an R1, so you don't really
So
want,
you can't,
you
well,
really
you have
don't
some
want to do that.
restrictions of
on
how
that.
close you can be
Yeah.
to them to the R.
So what they're doing is, see, they're surrounding of R1 with B, so that's a no-no.
Prior to the revisions of the zoning code in 2003, all property newly annexed to the city came in as an R1 designation. When the zoning code was changed in 2003, it said that designations, different designations could be placed at that time. So we could just as easily be here and they could be saying we want everything zoned R1. And then if you wanted to change anything later, you'd go through this process again. So there's a little more planning involved with it now than there was in the past.
Okay. Do you have any more questions for him?
Nope.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Said nobody still wants to say anything. Okay. Right, we'll close this public hearing at 2:45. And put this away and move these papers and get out the other one. Okay, where's the top sheet? There it is. 5. All right, the next thing we have is a public hearing, which again was advertised as required by law. And this is a public hearing and to review and comment on proposed rezoning of land designated M manufacturing to R3 multifamily residential. It's the area commonly called Athens Landmark. Now, at one point in the past, we did attempt to take that M zone out of there. We tried to do that, and we didn't get there. Okay. Right, map, where's the map? Here's some maps. We're only discussing the one section, which is one of those together. We don't have a, here's another, here's the existing, here's a bigger map that shows it. There's none of this one. Here. Okay. All right, did, somebody signed up to speak? He did.
You want Steve to go over the,
Yeah, you want to give a little
because
background
this,
on that?
if I
This one.
remember, Steve was manufacturing at the time zoning came in because
Right.
of the fertilizer operation Landmark had.
And the
If that
train,
was anything.
train
That's
came
the
through
train
there.
came through there.
Came
too.
through there.
The railroad bed that essentially followed along the Hocking River, until recently, there was a big bump in Stimson right before you got to the bridge. That's where the railroad went through right there along the river, and there was a spur that came off that went to Landmark. Essentially runs where Croft Woodworking is now, behind the post office, actually by the Roller Bowl, and then went to Landmark. The rail line existed at the time the initial zoning map was created in 1960. So those areas were reserved for manufacturing use. Since then, the railroads pulled out, and there's really no way to practically have, any kind of transportation of goods. But the zoning was never changed. Now, recently, I guess it's been a few years ago, when Baker and Lavelle, at a more easterly portion of this rail spur, wanted to build some residential buildings, a commercial space. They had some mini storage. We had to go through a rezoning in that area. It also used to go through back there and pick up what I think was called Meredith Oil at the end of Hawking Street. So that was, in times past, there was a lot of manufacturing, industrial type use right there. As a matter of fact, where Athens Mold and Machine and SunPower are at, that's still zoned in. With Baker and Lavelle, we cleaned up a little bit of their zoning, did away with the M, went to R3 below the old rail bed, B3 above the rail bed. And the Meredith Oil property was rezoned at the same time from M to R3. So as projects have come up, we've steadily been working our way down the old rail spur, and this just happens to be the last property on that rail spur. Landmark is really buried in a residential zone, but it's just a remnant of what was from the past, and then the different changes that have happened since then, since the removal of the railroad.
There's three sides of it are R3 and one side is B3.
The side adjacent to the north is part of the Stimson Avenue B3 corridor. On the south and east and west, both sides, that's all multifamily residential, R3. Senior housing is across the street on Kurtz. To the south is right to the south is Oak Street. Oak Street just dead ends into the property. That's all multifamily residential. And all of Palmer Street, which is on the east side of the property, is all multifamily residential. So what you're doing essentially, in my mind, is just blending in this area to the uses that are most common surrounding it, but not giving up anything toward the north on the Stimson corridor. There could have been a proposal to rezone the old Bob's site, the grocery store site, as R3 residential also. But when you do that, then you kind of removed that consistency and the integrity of the business zoning down Stimson. So, but that was not a proposal. It was not a proposal to rezone the Bob's. It's going to stay B3, just as it is now. And all we're looking at is the old Landmark site. And so it's everything south of the rail bed turning to R3, as everything else is there, and nothing changing to the north through the railroad.
But if you changed that B3 at Stimson where Bob's was, you would be putting that in the midst of a B3, because the Castler building, where
Exactly.
the financial services and everything is, and that's a B. And then does B go up on Carpenter?
On Carpenter, yes, the B3
runs into the downtown area.
Yeah, the third block of the uptown area is actually the most westerly portion of this B3 corridor.
Right.
That essentially runs from the Masonic Hall and the Armory area, all the way to the city limits, clear out off the Stimson Avenue Bridge and headed out of town. That whole corridor through there is B3, and then one block dropping south on Court Street is also in that B3 zone. So yeah, rezoning Bob's to R3 would be inconsistent with the zoning there.
That's right.
The existing
That
zone.
was my point. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to speak?
Would it be appropriate to comment on the letter that we provided to the planning?
Not at the zoning hearing.
No, this is just about the zoning. So you don't have anything to say about the zoning? Okay. This has nothing to do with any of this stuff. It's just changing that zone, which makes sense. Anybody else have anything they want to say? Okay. We won't take any action today on the zone because we don't have quorum, and we don't usually do it right after the public.
And we didn't schedule a meeting.
And we didn't schedule a meeting, we didn't really two of us here. So that will close this hearing. It's 2:53. Okay. Yeah, did you, don't close the hearing. He's got one more thing.
All right, he says it doesn't have to do with the hearing.
Well, then I close the hearing.
No, the
Okay.
hearing's still
Okay,
closed.
the hearing's still closed. Close the hearing.
I just wanted to remind everyone that, as I mentioned at the last planning commission a week ago, planning commission is taking public input on a proposal for a business use variance at 315 East State Street.
Yeah, it's-
I placed a legal ad in the newspaper. This is something where there's no timelines involved, but it was in the paper yesterday. And I mailed out letters to approximately 120 residents within 500 feet. I have gotten a couple phone calls so far, and some people can't attend, so I encourage them to write letters in, expressing their opinion. And I haven't, so I sent out the letters, did the legal ad. I still haven't gotten a hold of the Near East Side Neighborhood Association, but that's as easy as sending an email to Mr. Baum, Ms. Holly, just, and I'm sure the word's out in the neighborhood after 120 letters went out.
Yeah, I wasn't at the last meeting, so I didn't know anything about any, but that's all right.
So it's been widely advertised. And then it's scheduled to go before the Board of Zoning Appeals on May the 9th, which is the following Tuesday. Mr. Smeltzer might opt, to drop the case, to have it withdrawn. He'd probably be curious to see the input that we get next Thursday from people in the neighborhood.
Well, why are we having, that doesn't go every other, if we're having the planning commission on the 4th, does that work?
Yeah, May the 4th.
But then the 9th doesn't work.
No, the
The 9th is zoning board.
9th is
Oh, the zoning board,
they'd like
okay,
our
I just got
report
this.
by the
They
9th,
want it by
so
the 9th,
we
okay. I
scheduled
just saw this, now I don't.
input.
Okay.
Is that the 2 o'clock, did we schedule that at 2 o'clock?
It'll just be on the normal agenda.
Just on the
6:30.
normal, that's, we're just telling the normal agenda.
Right.
We continued the case, as I recall, but we want input from neighbors.
See, I just got the minutes and I wasn't at the last meeting, so I haven't had a chance to read them.
There's no requirement for a public hearing on such things as this. I suppose you could call it a planning commission request of the community for public input.
Right.
Is what we're doing. Just try to get it as widely advertised and discussed as possible.
Okay. I just didn't think about it.
Uninformed public. Uninformed.
Uninformed, huh? Had to go. Okay. Do you want to hear about the funeral?
Well, how are you doing? It's been a rough year on you.
Well, he's been sick, I knew he was bad. They called me the weekend on Sunday or Saturday, and she said he was bad. And then she said, oh, we all perked up, and they said, it's what Alex did, and about 3 or 4 days will go by, and then he'll die, and he did, so. He had Parkinson's, which was in the last stages where they shut down. And
Yeah. I've got 2 neighbors with Parkinson's.
yeah, for a long time he was okay. The meeting's over, you don't have to tell me on TV telling about my brother's